This is a story about love, after everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Your fiancé puts something in your son's food. The words cut through the elegant restaurant like a glass, shattering in slow motion. Conversation stopped. Forks hovered in midair. Even the soft jazz drifting from the speakers seemed to hesitate. Claire Hart stood beside table 12, her hands trembling slightly around the edge of her order pad, but her eyes were steady. Across from her sat Ethan Wells, a billionaire known in business magazines as the man who never reacted twice to the same surprise. Yet in that moment, he did something no one at the table had ever seen before. He froze. His gaze snapped from the waitress to the small plate in front of his 7-year-old son. What did he eat? Ethan asked quietly. Not angry. Not shouting. Just precise. Claire swallowed. She had spent the last 4 years learning how to stay invisible in rooms like these, rooms filled with polished shoes, tailored suits, and people who believed money solved every inconvenience in the world. But invisibility wasn't an option anymore. The pasta, she said. He only took 2 bites. The boy, Noah Wells, looked up from his chair with the casual curiosity only a child could have in a room suddenly filled with tension. Dad, it tasted kind of weird. The woman seated beside Ethan, Madeline Cross, his fiancée, let out a soft laugh that sounded almost musical. That's ridiculous, she said smoothly, brushing a strand of perfect blonde hair behind her ear. Claire, isn't it? I think you're overreacting. Her smile was polite, the kind people practiced in mirrors before charity galas. Around the table, a few guests shifted awkwardly. This was supposed to be a celebration dinner. Engagement announcements. Champagne. Photographers waiting outside. Not a waitress making accusations. But Claire didn't move. She didn't apologize. Instead, she leaned slightly closer to the table and pointed at the silver spoon resting near Noah's plate. Look at the edge, she said calmly. Ethan followed her finger. At first, it looked like nothing. Just the polished shine of expensive cutlery reflecting warm restaurant lights. Then he noticed it, a faint dusting of powder along the rim of the spoon. Not flour. Not salt. Something else. Where did you see that? Ethan asked. When she stirred the plate. Claire kept her voice steady, though her heart pounded hard enough she was sure the nearby tables could hear it. And there's a smell. Almonds. Very faint. Madeline's smile thinned, almost imperceptibly. Ethan, this is absurd. Are we really entertaining this? But Ethan wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Claire, studying her the same way he studied quarterly reports and billion-dollar proposals. Carefully. Quietly. Tony, he said without raising his voice. From across the dining room, Chef Tony, who had been nervously watching the scene from the kitchen doorway, hurried over, wiping his hands on a towel. Yes, Mr. Wells. Ethan gestured toward the plate. Taste this. Tony blinked. Taste it. You said the dish was perfect 5 minutes ago. The chef hesitated for half a second, then scooped a small forkful and placed it in his mouth. He chewed thoughtfully. Then his face turned bright red. Oh wow. Okay, there is definitely something spicy in there I did not. He coughed, grabbed a water glass, and took a long drink while several nearby diners tried not to laugh nervously. Even Noah giggled. The tension cracked for a brief second. Claire noticed it first. A faint flush spreading across Noah's neck. Small red spots appearing near his collar. Her voice softened instantly. Ethan, she said quietly, look at his skin. The billionaire turned back to his son. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. The calm expression he wore in boardrooms around the world disappeared. Not replaced by panic. Just by focus. Noah, buddy, how do you feel? Kind of itchy, the boy said, scratching lightly at his arm. Claire moved closer, kneeling beside the chair, so she was eye level with him. Hey Noah, she said gently. Can you take a slow breath for me? The boy copied her, inhaling and exhaling carefully. Ethan watched her with growing confusion. Waitresses didn't usually talk like that, or move like that, or notice things like powdered residue and almond scents. You've done this before, he said quietly. Claire glanced up at him for a split second. Yes. Madeline folded her arms. This is becoming a ridiculous performance. But Ethan's attention had already shifted somewhere else. Not to the guests. Not to the embarrassment. To the quiet competence of the woman kneeling beside his son like she belonged there. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Wells realized something unusual. The most important person in the room might not be the billionaire. It might be the waitress who refused to stay silent. And what none of them knew yet, except Claire, was that the small detail she had noticed on that spoon was about to unravel a plan far more calculated than anyone at the table could imagine. Claire kept her voice calm, even though the entire dining room now felt like it was holding its breath. "Noah, keep breathing slowly like that," she said gently, watching the boy's shoulders rise and fall. The red patches along his neck were not dramatic, not frightening to look at, but to someone who knew what they meant, they were unmistakable signals. Ethan Wells saw the change too. His hand moved instinctively to the boy's shoulder. "Is he going to be all right?" he asked. It was the first time anyone in the room had heard uncertainty in his voice. Claire nodded carefully. "Right now it looks like a mild reaction, not severe. But we should not take chances." She glanced at the table again, then back at Ethan. "Does Noah have any known allergies?" Ethan answered immediately. "Tree nuts. Specifically almonds." The moment the word left his mouth, the silence around the table thickened. Several guests exchanged uneasy looks. Claire exhaled slowly. "That matches what I smelled." Madeline let out a soft, almost amused sigh. "This is getting out of hand." "Almonds? In a restaurant like this?" She gestured lightly toward the elegant dining room with its crystal lights and polished marble floor. "Do you honestly believe the kitchen would make such a mistake?" Chef Tony, still clutching a glass of water, quickly shook his head. "We do not even keep almonds in this kitchen tonight. None of the dishes on the menu contain them." Ethan's gaze shifted slowly from Tony to the spoon and finally to Madeline. The movement was subtle, but the temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. Madeline noticed. Her smile remained polished, but a tiny crease appeared between her brows. "Ethan, please do not look at me like that," she said gently. "You know I would never do anything to hurt Noah." Claire remained kneeling beside the boy, quietly observing the adults above her. She had learned long ago that sometimes the most important clues were not spoken out loud. They appeared in pauses, in the way someone inhaled before answering a question, in the way their eyes moved when they thought no one was watching. And right now, Madeline Cross was watching Ethan very carefully. "Noah," Claire said softly, redirecting the attention. "Do you have your allergy medication with you tonight?" The boy nodded. "Dad keeps it in the car." Ethan pulled out his phone immediately. "I will have my driver bring it inside." He sent the message quickly, then crouched slightly so he was closer to his son's eye level. "You are doing great, buddy." Noah gave a small grin. "I feel okay. Just itchy." Claire studied the boy's breathing again. "Still steady." "That was good." She stood up slowly. "It should arrive in a minute. In the meantime, water will help." She reached for the pitcher and filled a glass, placing it gently in front of Noah. Around them, the restaurant slowly began breathing again. Quiet whispers spread from table to table. A few diners subtly pulled out their phones, but the manager quickly stepped in to discourage any photos. This was not the kind of scene high-end restaurants liked appearing online. Ethan noticed none of it. His attention was fixed on Claire. "How did you recognize it so quickly?" he asked. Claire hesitated. For a second, it looked as if she might brush the question aside. Then she simply answered, "I used to work in healthcare." "Used to?" Ethan asked. "Emergency response training," she said carefully. "You learn to notice small signs before they become big ones." Madeline folded her arms again. "How impressive," she said lightly. "But I still fail to understand why a waitress believes she can accuse someone of tampering with food at my fiancé's table." Claire did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. She simply met Madeline's gaze. "I did not accuse anyone," she said calmly. "I described what I saw." The difference between those two statements hung in the air like a quiet challenge. Madeline opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when Ethan suddenly spoke. "Tony." The chef straightened instantly. "Yes, sir?" "I want the kitchen cameras reviewed." Tony blinked. "The cameras?" "And the hallway cameras outside the private dining area." Ethan's voice was calm again now, almost cold, the kind of tone that made executives nervous during corporate meetings. Madeline laughed softly. "Ethan, this is completely unnecessary." He turned toward her slowly. "My son had a reaction to something he should not have been exposed to." His voice remained quiet, but every word landed with precision. "That makes it necessary." At that exact moment, the front door of the restaurant opened and Ethan's driver hurried inside carrying a small medical kit. Noah accepted the medication without complaint, still smiling faintly as if the entire situation were an interesting adventure. Within minutes, the redness on his skin began fading. Claire watched closely until she was certain the reaction was calming down. Only then did she allow herself to relax slightly. But Ethan was not relaxing, not even a little, because now that the immediate danger had passed, something else had taken its place. Questions. And Ethan Wells was not a man who ignored unanswered questions. He looked once more at the spoon on the table, then at Madeline, then back at Claire. And for the first time that evening, he realized something even more unsettling than the strange powder on the spoon. The waitress who had warned him did not look relieved that she had been right. She looked worried about what would happen next. The dining room slowly returned to its quiet rhythm, but the table at the center of the room remained wrapped in a tension that no music or polite conversation could soften. Noah sat calmly now, the faint redness on his neck almost gone, sipping water and swinging his feet under the chair as if the entire moment had already passed in his mind. Children had a way of moving forward faster than adults. Ethan Wells, however, did not move forward. He watched everything, every movement, every expression. Claire Hart stepped back half a pace, allowing the family a little space now that the immediate concern had faded. She picked up the spoon again carefully and placed it on a small napkin beside the plate. She did not touch the powder. She simply made sure it stayed exactly where it was. Ethan noticed that. Of course he did. He noticed details the way other people noticed weather. "Do not clear this table yet," he said quietly to the nearby server who had approached out of habit. The young man nodded quickly and stepped away. Madeline Cross gave a small laugh that sounded patient, almost sympathetic. "Ethan, you are turning a dinner into a courtroom." She rested her hand lightly on the edge of the table, the diamond ring catching the warm light from the chandelier above. "Our son is fine." Ethan did not look at the ring. He looked at Noah, who was now happily describing the restaurant's giant dessert menu to the driver who had brought the medication. Only when he was certain the boy was comfortable did Ethan shift his attention back to the adults at the table. "He is fine because someone noticed something," Ethan said. His eyes moved toward Claire for a moment before returning to Madeline. The tone was still calm, but something about it made the guests nearby stop pretending not to listen. Madeline tilted her head slightly. "And you believe that someone is me?" It was not exactly a question. Claire spoke before Ethan could answer. "I do not believe anything yet." Her voice was steady, careful. "But there is a detail that does not make sense." Madeline smiled thinly. "Please enlighten us." Claire pointed gently toward the spoon again. "If the kitchen does not use almonds tonight, and if the ingredient is not part of the recipe, then the powder had to be introduced after the dish left the kitchen." Chef Tony nodded quickly from across the table. "The plates come directly from the past to the server. No one touches them after that." Madeline shrugged softly. "So perhaps the kitchen made a mistake and refuses to admit it." Claire shook her head slightly. "If it were a kitchen mistake, the ingredient would be mixed throughout the food." She gestured to the plate. "But the residue is only on the spoon." That quiet observation settled over the table like a puzzle piece finally snapping into place. Ethan leaned back in his chair slowly, meaning someone added it after the dish arrived. Madeline let out another small laugh. "Ethan, this is absurd speculation." But Ethan was not reacting to speculation. He was reacting to patterns. The kind of patterns that built corporations and destroyed them. His phone buzzed softly in his hand. He glanced down at the screen for only a moment before looking up again. "The hallway cameras are already being reviewed," he said calmly. Madeline blinked once. Just once. But Claire saw it. That tiny flicker of surprise. The moment someone realized events were moving faster than expected. Madeline recovered quickly, crossing one leg elegantly over the other. "You really are serious about this?" "Yes," Ethan replied simply. Across the table, Noah suddenly spoke up again. "Dad, Claire saved me, right?" The boy's voice carried the innocent certainty only children had. Ethan looked at his son, and something softened in his expression for a brief second. "Yes," he said quietly. Noah grinned and turned to Claire. "Thank you." Claire gave him a small smile. "You did the hard part. You stayed calm." The boy seemed very pleased with that answer. Madeline watched the exchange carefully. Then she leaned slightly closer to Ethan and lowered her voice, though not enough to avoid being overheard. "You are letting a waitress turn you against the woman you are about to marry." Ethan finally turned to look directly at her. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This one felt heavier. more deliberate. I am letting evidence guide the conversation, he said. Madeline's smile faded by a fraction. Evidence. Ethan gestured lightly toward the spoon. That is one piece. Then he lifted his phone slightly. The cameras will provide another. Claire felt a strange chill run through her, even though the room was warm. Because now the moment she had been hoping to avoid was getting closer. The moment when the truth would no longer be theoretical. The moment when someone's plan would be exposed. Madeline leaned back slowly in her chair. For the first time that evening, she did not try to argue. She simply watched Ethan with a quiet intensity that made Claire uneasy, because it was the look of someone calculating the next move. And in that silent exchange across the table, Claire realized something troubling. Whatever had happened to Noah's food tonight was not a random mistake. It was part of something much larger. And the person who had arranged it might still believe they could control how the story ended. The quiet tension at the table deepened as the minutes passed, stretching the evening into something far different from the elegant celebration it had been meant to be. Claire Hart remained standing a short distance from the table now, her hands folded loosely in front of her apron as she tried to appear like any other waitress, simply waiting for the next request. But nothing about this moment was ordinary. Ethan Wells sat very still, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably alert, like a man listening for something only he expected to hear. Across from him, Madeline Cross maintained the same polished composure she had worn all evening, but the effortless confidence that had once defined her presence now seemed carefully constructed rather than natural. Noah, unaware of the storm forming around the adults, had already moved on to studying the dessert menu again, whispering excitedly to the driver about a chocolate lava cake that looked as big as a baseball. Claire allowed herself a small breath of relief seeing the boy smile again. That was the part that mattered most. But relief did not last long. Ethan's phone vibrated softly against the table. The sound was barely noticeable, yet every person seated nearby seemed to hear it. Ethan glanced at the screen without immediately reacting. Then he looked up. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly. "The camera footage is ready," he said calmly. Madeline leaned back in her chair, folding her arms again with a faint smile that appeared almost amused. "Then by all means," she said lightly, "let us solve this grand mystery." Ethan did not answer her. Instead, he tapped the screen once and turned the phone so the small group at the table could see. The image was grainy but clear enough to recognize the private dining hallway outside the room. Guests passed occasionally. Servers moved through carrying trays. Then the footage paused. Ethan's thumb hovered briefly before he pressed play again. The hallway scene repeated from a few minutes earlier that evening. A server emerged from the kitchen carrying Noah's plate. The dish looked exactly as it had when it arrived at the table. Nothing unusual. The server stepped into the private room and placed the plate in front of the boy. For several seconds nothing happened. Conversation continued around the table. Then a new figure leaned slightly forward in the frame. Madeline Cross. She reached toward Noah with a gentle smile, the way an affectionate adult might help a child adjust a napkin or straighten silverware. Her hand moved briefly over the table. Only a second, maybe two. Then she withdrew her hand and continued speaking to the guests as if nothing had happened. Ethan paused the video there. Silence spread across the table again, heavier than before. Claire felt a subtle tightening in her chest. She had expected something like this, but seeing it unfold so clearly still carried a strange weight. Madeline stared at the screen for a moment before letting out a small breath of laughter. "Ethan, that proves nothing," she said calmly. "I was helping Noah with his spoon." Ethan did not look away from the paused image. "You were touching the spoon," he said quietly. "Yes," Madeline replied smoothly, "which is hardly a crime." Noah glanced between the adults, sensing the shift in tone now. "Dad," he asked softly. Ethan's voice immediately softened. "It is all right, buddy." The boy nodded slowly but continued watching with wide eyes. Claire noticed the way Ethan's focus shifted instantly when speaking to his son, then returned to the discussion with precise control. Madeline leaned slightly forward again. "You cannot possibly believe I would harm Noah," she said, her voice measured but carrying the faintest edge of disbelief. "I have been planning a future with you. With both of you." Ethan turned off the video and placed the phone down carefully on the table. "That is exactly what I am trying to understand," he said. His tone was not angry. It was analytical, the same tone he used when negotiating billion-dollar deals. Claire recognized it immediately. This was not emotion speaking. This was investigation. Madeline's expression hardened for just a moment before she recovered her composure. Then perhaps your waitress should explain why she thinks she knows more about my intentions than I do, she said coolly. For the first time since the footage appeared, the attention of the entire table shifted fully to Claire. She felt every eye on her. Normally, she would have stepped back, apologized for the disturbance, and disappeared quietly into the background of the restaurant. That was the rule of service work. Stay invisible. Stay polite. Do not interfere in the lives of people with power. But tonight that rule had already been broken. Claire met Ethan's gaze for a moment before answering. I do not know your intentions, she said calmly. But I do know something about patterns. Madeline raised an eyebrow slightly. Patterns. Claire nodded toward the screen of the phone. You moved the spoon after the plate arrived. And the residue is on the spoon, not the food. She paused briefly before continuing. And the reaction Noah experienced matches exactly the kind of exposure that happens when a trace allergen touches the mouth without being mixed into the meal. The room grew quiet again as that explanation settled in. Ethan studied Claire carefully, as though measuring each word she spoke. Madeline remained silent for several seconds. Then she slowly straightened in her chair and gave a quiet smile that did not reach her eyes. So that is your theory, she said softly. But theories are not the same as proof. Claire felt that uneasy chill return. Because Madeline did not sound defensive anymore. She sounded confident again, as if she believed the story was still under her control. And in that moment Claire realized something even more troubling than before. The video might have revealed a crucial detail. But whoever had started this plan might already have prepared for that possibility. Madeline's calm confidence lingered in the air like a carefully rehearsed performance. And for a moment the entire table remained silent, as if everyone were waiting for the next move in a chess game no one fully understood yet. Ethan Wells sat with his hands lightly folded on the table, his gaze steady but unreadable. Anyone who had ever negotiated with him in a boardroom knew that expression well. It was the look he wore when a conversation had quietly shifted from polite discussion to strategic evaluation. Across the table, Madeline Cross returned his gaze with the same composure. Her posture perfect, her tone smooth when she finally spoke again. Ethan, I understand why this situation looks suspicious, she said, her voice measured and almost sympathetic. But suspicion is not evidence. She gestured toward the phone resting on the table. That footage shows me adjusting a spoon. Nothing more. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward Noah, who was now happily dipping a breadstick into a small bowl of olive oil, completely unconcerned with the adult tension surrounding him. Seeing his son comfortable again seemed to ground Ethan's focus even further. He turned back toward Madeline. You are correct, he said calmly. Suspicion is not evidence. Madeline gave a small nod, as if the conversation were finally returning to reason. But Ethan continued speaking. That is why evidence is useful. He lifted the napkin that still held the spoon Claire had set aside earlier. The faint trace of powder remained visible along the edge of the metal surface under the warm restaurant lighting. This spoon was not part of the kitchen preparation, Ethan said quietly, and the residue was noticed before anyone here knew Noah would have a reaction. Madeline's smile remained steady, but Claire noticed the slightest tightening of her jaw. So perhaps the powder was already there when the spoon arrived, Madeline replied smoothly. Restaurants are not laboratories, Ethan. Chef Tony shifted nervously a few feet away. Our silverware is polished and inspected before service, he said quickly. There should not be any residue. Madeline turned toward him with polite patience. Should not be is not the same as impossible. The exchange hung in the air, balanced between logic and doubt. Claire stood quietly beside the table, feeling the weight of the moment pressing against her. She had not intended to become part of this conversation at all. She had only noticed something unusual and spoken up before it was too late. Yet now every word seemed to carry consequences far beyond the walls of this restaurant. Ethan's attention shifted toward her again. Claire, he said calmly, when you noticed the residue, what exactly made you look that closely? The question was simple, but the room seemed to lean closer to hear the answer. Claire hesitated for only a moment before responding. Habit, she said. In emergency response training you learn that small details often appear before bigger problems do. Madeline tilted her head slightly. Emergency response training? For a waitress. Claire met her gaze without hesitation. People change careers sometimes. The answer was neutral, but something in Claire's steady tone made Ethan watch her with growing curiosity. He had already noticed her calm earlier when Noah showed signs of a reaction. It had not been the reaction of someone panicking or guessing. It had been precise, practiced, the kind of composure that came from experience rather than theory. Madeline, however, seemed unimpressed. That still does not explain why you assumed the residue came from me, she said coolly. Claire shook her head gently. I did not assume anything. She paused briefly, then added, I only followed the sequence. Madeline's eyebrow lifted slightly. Sequence. Claire gestured lightly toward Ethan's phone. The footage shows when the spoon moved. She pointed toward the napkin holding the spoon. The residue appears exactly where a small amount of powder would settle if something had been brushed across the surface. Madeline's smile faded by a fraction. You seem very confident for someone who was not even at the table at that moment. Claire answered calmly. I was watching the room. That statement drew another quiet silence from the guests nearby, because it revealed something important. Claire had not simply been passing by when she noticed the detail. She had been observing carefully the entire time. Madeline leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful now rather than dismissive. Interesting, she said softly. Very observant. Ethan's gaze shifted again between the two women. One calm, but clearly defensive. The other calm, but completely unafraid. And in that contrast he began to notice something else. Madeline's arguments were focused on doubt. Claire's explanations were focused on sequence, on details, on timing. Ethan picked up the spoon again, turning it slightly so the light caught the faint residue along the metal surface. Then he spoke quietly. There is one more detail. Madeline looked at him with measured patience. And what detail is that? Ethan set the spoon down again carefully on the napkin. My son's allergy, he said. Very few people know exactly how sensitive it is. His eyes rested on Madeline for a moment longer than necessary. But someone who had discussed our future together would know. The meaning behind the words did not need to be explained. The room seemed to grow even quieter. Madeline remained still for several seconds before speaking again. And when she finally did, her voice was still calm. But something beneath the calm had changed. Ethan, she said slowly. Are you accusing me of planning something? Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply answered with the same controlled tone he had used all evening. I am asking why the sequence of events tonight seems so carefully arranged. And in that moment Claire realized the evening had crossed another invisible line. Because what had begun as a suspicious detail in a child's dinner was now becoming something much larger. Something deliberate. Something that might have been designed long before anyone sat down at this table. The silence that followed Ethan Wells's final question was different from anything that had happened earlier that evening. Before, the tension had felt uncertain, like a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared. Now it felt deliberate, as if every person at the table understood that something important had just shifted. Madeline Cross remained very still, her fingers lightly resting against the tablecloth. The elegant dining room lights reflected in the diamond ring on her hand, scattering small flashes across the polished silverware. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she smiled again, but this time the warmth that usually accompanied that smile was gone. You are imagining something far more dramatic than what actually happened, she said calmly. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead he watched her carefully, the same way a seasoned investor studies a presentation that seems polished but contains subtle inconsistencies. Am I? He asked quietly. Madeline leaned slightly forward. Yes, she said. You are turning a coincidence into a conspiracy because a waitress suggested a theory. Claire Hart stood beside the table, listening without interrupting. She had learned long ago that the most powerful moments in a conversation were often the ones where silence allowed truth to reveal itself. Noah, however, had grown curious again. The boy looked from one adult to another, his small brow wrinkling with confusion. Dad, he asked softly, are we still getting dessert? The simple question broke the heavy tension for a moment. Ethan looked at his son and allowed a small smile to return. Yes, we are, he said. Just give us a few minutes. Noah nodded and returned to studying the dessert menu again, as if the answer had solved everything. Ethan's attention returned to Madeline. Let us review the sequence again, he said calmly. The kitchen confirms there are no almonds in tonight's dishes. The spoon shows residue. The camera shows you touching the spoon after the plate arrived. Madeline lifted her shoulders in a graceful shrug. And none of that proves intent. Ethan tilted his head slightly. That is true. The agreement seemed to surprise her for a moment. Then Ethan continued. But it does show opportunity. Claire noticed the subtle change in Madeline's posture when that word was spoken. Opportunity. It was a term often used in business negotiations, but tonight it carried a different weight. Madeline rested her elbows lightly on the table, her tone patient again. Even if I touched the spoon, why would I do something like that, she asked. What possible reason would I have? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Claire for a brief moment. Claire understood the unspoken request. She stepped slightly closer to the table. When someone uses a trace allergen, she said carefully, the reaction can look serious, but usually fades quickly if treated immediately. Madeline watched her with narrow eyes. And your point? Claire continued calmly. The person who knows about the allergy could create a controlled reaction. Enough to cause alarm, not enough to cause lasting harm. The words hung in the air like the final line of a carefully constructed equation. Ethan finished the thought quietly. And the person who notices the reaction first becomes the hero. Madeline's expression changed by the smallest fraction. It was not shock, not anger. Something closer to irritation that the pattern had been noticed sooner than expected. She leaned back slowly in her chair. You think I staged this so I could pretend to save Noah? Ethan did not raise his voice. I think you knew his allergy well enough to predict the outcome. Madeline laughed softly again, but this time the sound carried a sharper edge. Ethan, that is a ridiculous assumption. Claire watched her carefully, because now that the theory had been spoken aloud, something about Madeline's calm felt different. Less confident, more calculating. Why would I need to pretend to save Noah? Madeline asked. You already trust me. Ethan studied her for a long moment before answering. Trust, he said quietly, is not the same as influence. That single word seemed to shift the atmosphere again. Influence. Claire understood what Ethan was implying before he said anything else. Madeline's engagement to Ethan was not just a romantic partnership. It was a position of enormous social and financial significance. The future wife of one of the most powerful business figures in the country would gain access to influence, reputation, and networks that could reshape entire industries. Madeline's gaze remained steady, but her smile had vanished completely now. You believe I would manipulate a situation involving your son just to gain influence? She asked. Ethan folded his hands calmly on the table. I believe someone ambitious might create a moment where they appear indispensable. Claire felt a quiet chill at those words. Because if Ethan's theory was correct, the plan had been carefully designed. A small allergic reaction, a sudden crisis, and then a dramatic rescue by the person who caused it. But something had gone wrong. Someone else had noticed the detail first. Madeline turned slowly toward Claire. Her voice remained polite, but the warmth was completely gone. You seem very certain about your conclusions. Claire met her gaze without hesitation. I am certain about the sequence, she said. The conclusions are still yours to explain. For several seconds Madeline said nothing. Then she gave a quiet sigh and shook her head slightly. Ethan, she said softly, you are letting suspicion ruin an evening that was supposed to celebrate our future. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. If our future depends on ignoring questions, he replied calmly, then it was never very stable to begin with. The words settled across the table with quiet finality. And for the first time that evening, Madeline Cross looked less like someone controlling the story and more like someone realizing the story had already begun to move beyond her control. For several long seconds after Ethan's final words, no one at the table moved. The elegant restaurant continued its quiet rhythm around them, waiters gliding past with polished trays and soft jazz drifting through the room. Yet the small circle surrounding Ethan Wells's table felt strangely separate from the rest of the evening. Madeline Cross remained seated perfectly upright, but the confidence that once filled her posture now seemed carefully reconstructed rather than natural. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table, tapping once in a slow, thoughtful rhythm before becoming still again. Claire Hart noticed the movement immediately. Small gestures often revealed what words try to hide. Ethan watched as well. Madeline, he said calmly, you have still not answered the question. Madeline turned her gaze back toward him. Which question is that? She asked softly. Ethan did not blink. Why you were the one touching the spoon? Madeline gave a small sigh, as though she were explaining something obvious to someone who had simply misunderstood the situation. Because Noah asked for help, she said. She gestured lightly toward the boy, who was now leaning over the dessert menu with deep concentration. He was trying to twirl the pasta and dropped the spoon. I adjusted it. That is all. Noah looked up suddenly when he heard his name. Oh yeah, he said, thinking for a moment. The spoon did fall. The boy seemed proud of remembering an important detail. Claire watched Ethan carefully, wondering if the new information would change his thinking. Ethan nodded slowly toward his son. Did Madeline touch the spoon after that? Noah thought again, his small brow wrinkling in concentration. Maybe, he said. I was talking about the lava cake. The uncertainty of the answer hung in the air. Madeline spread her hands slightly, as if the moment had just proven her point. Children drop things, she said gently. Sometimes adults pick them up. Ethan did not immediately respond. Instead, he turned toward Claire again. When you noticed the residue, how long had the plate been at the table? Claire answered without hesitation. Less than 1 minute. Madeline tilted her head slightly. Which means it could have been there the entire time. Claire nodded slowly. It could have been. Madeline gave a satisfied smile. Thank you. But Claire continued speaking before the moment could settle. Except the powder was not on the fork. Or the plate. Only the spoon. Madeline's smile paused for half a second. And Claire kept her tone neutral. That suggests contact, not contamination. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, studying the spoon where it still rested on the folded napkin. A single point of contact, he murmured. Madeline shook her head slowly. Ethan, this is becoming exhausting. She leaned slightly closer to him, lowering her voice just enough that the nearby tables would not easily overhear. You are letting speculation turn into accusation. Ethan's reply was calm. No, I am letting questions remain unanswered. Claire felt a strange shift in the room at that moment. Earlier the conversation had been tense but controlled. Now it felt like something was quietly building beneath the surface. Madeline looked at Ethan for a long moment, and then something surprising happened. She laughed. Not the polite, careful laugh she had used earlier. This one was softer, almost amused. Do you know what fascinates me about you, Ethan? She said. Ethan said nothing. Madeline continued. You built an empire by analyzing patterns. By assuming there is always another layer to the story. She gestured toward Claire. And now a waitress notices something unusual, and suddenly you believe you are uncovering a grand strategy. Claire felt the subtle sting in the word waitress, but she remained silent. Ethan's voice stayed calm. Patterns exist whether we acknowledge them or not. Madeline's eyes sharpened slightly. Then perhaps you should analyze this pattern. She leaned back in her chair again and folded her hands. I am the woman who agreed to become part of your family. I have spent months planning a life that includes Noah. Why would I risk destroying that? The question lingered in the air. Ethan watched her. For a long moment. Claire noticed the way he was thinking now, not emotionally, but logically, the same way someone might examine a puzzle with missing pieces. Because, Ethan said slowly, sometimes people believe they can control the outcome. Madeline raised an eyebrow. Control what outcome? Ethan gestured lightly toward Noah, who was now whispering excitedly to the driver about which dessert looked the biggest. A situation where you appear indispensable. Madeline's smile faded slightly again. Claire felt the same chill she had felt earlier return. Because the theory Ethan was describing was simple. If Madeline had created a mild allergic reaction and then dramatically noticed it first, she would have become the hero of the evening. The person who saved the billionaire's son. A story that would travel quickly through social circles and media headlines. But the plan had changed the moment Claire noticed the detail before anyone else. Madeline turned her gaze slowly toward Claire. You are very observant, she said quietly. Claire answered just as calmly. Only when something does not fit. Madeline studied her face for a moment longer, then looked back at Ethan. You see, she said softly. She enjoys the mystery. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, he replied. She noticed something that might have been missed. For a moment no one spoke. Then Noah suddenly raised his hand like a student in a classroom. Can I say something? He asked. Ethan turned toward him immediately. Of course. The boy looked around the table with the seriousness of someone delivering important news. Claire noticed the spoon before I even ate the third bite. He pointed toward her proudly. That means she saved dessert too. The innocent comment caused a few nearby guests to laugh quietly, the tension easing for just a second. Claire smiled faintly at the boy, but Ethan's expression remained thoughtful, because Noah had unknowingly pointed out something important. Claire had spoken before the situation had fully developed, before anyone else had time to react. Ethan looked at Claire again, and in that moment, he realized the most unusual part of the entire evening. The person who had disrupted the plan was not powerful, not wealthy, not influential. She was simply someone who refused to ignore a detail that did not make sense. The brief ripple of laughter caused by Noah's innocent comment faded quickly, leaving behind a quieter kind of tension that felt less dramatic but far more serious. Claire Hart remained standing beside the table, her posture calm, though she could feel the attention of the entire room shifting back toward their corner again. People were trying not to stare, but curiosity had a way of traveling silently across a dining room. Ethan Wells noticed it too. Without raising his voice, he lifted his hand slightly toward the restaurant manager standing near the entrance. The man understood immediately and discreetly signaled for the nearby tables to be served dessert and drinks a little farther from the private dining area. Within moments, the space around Ethan's table felt quieter, more contained. Madeline Cross watched the adjustment with a faint, thoughtful smile. "You always were good at controlling a room," she said softly. Ethan did not answer the observation. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. The spoon still lay on the folded napkin between them, like a small piece of evidence waiting for a verdict. "Claire noticed something unusual," he said calmly, and that observation changed the direction of the evening. Madeline glanced toward Claire again. "Yes," she replied. "It certainly did." Claire felt the subtle weight behind the words, but chose not to respond. She had learned that sometimes silence carried more strength than explanation. Madeline turned back to Ethan. "But let us assume, for a moment, that you are correct," she continued smoothly. "Let us assume that someone deliberately touched the spoon with something that caused a mild reaction." Ethan listened without interrupting. Madeline folded her hands neatly in front of her. "That still leaves one very important question," she said. "What would that person gain?" Ethan answered quietly. "Position." Madeline tilted her head slightly. "Position." Ethan nodded once. "A dramatic moment. A sudden emergency. Then the person who notices first becomes the one who saves the situation." Claire watched the exchange carefully. Ethan was not accusing anymore. He was simply explaining a pattern, the same way he might explain the logic behind a business strategy. Madeline listened as well, but when she spoke again, her tone was almost amused. "You are giving me far too much credit," she said. "If someone wanted to stage a heroic moment, there are far easier ways than risking a complicated reaction involving a child." Ethan did not disagree immediately. Instead, he studied her expression as if comparing it to something in his memory. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "but complicated plans sometimes exist because simple ones are too obvious." Madeline's smile grew a little sharper. "You always did enjoy puzzles." Ethan leaned back in his chair again, his expression thoughtful. Across the table, Noah had finished reading the dessert menu and was now whispering to the driver about which dessert might arrive the fastest. The normal rhythm of a child's evening had returned, completely disconnected from the quiet debate unfolding around him. Claire noticed that Ethan glanced toward his son more often now, as if making sure the boy remained comfortable. It was a small gesture, but it revealed something important about him. Madeline followed Ethan's gaze toward Noah as well. For a moment, her expression softened. "You really do care about him more than anything else," she said quietly. Ethan answered without hesitation. "Yes." Madeline nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already suspected. Then she looked back at Claire again. "And yet tonight the person he trusts most is someone he met 10 minutes ago." Claire blinked slightly at the remark. It was not an insult. Not exactly, but it carried a subtle challenge. Ethan noticed it too. "Trust is not determined by time," he said calmly. "Sometimes it is determined by action." Madeline studied him for a moment longer, then leaned back again with a thoughtful sigh. "You know what fascinates me about this entire situation?" she said. Ethan remained silent, waiting. Madeline gestured lightly toward the spoon again. "Everyone here is discussing a possibility, a theory, yet no one has actually tested the substance." The comment caused Chef Tony, who had been quietly standing nearby, to stiffen slightly. Ethan's gaze shifted toward him. "Tony," he said, Is there a way to analyze the residue? The chef nodded quickly. Yes, sir. The kitchen has a small allergen testing kit. We use it for special dietary requests. Madeline watched the exchange calmly. That seems reasonable, she said. After all, if you are going to accuse someone of staging a performance, you should at least confirm the ingredients. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken slightly, because now the situation was moving towards something definitive. Ethan lifted the spoon carefully again and handed it to Tony. Please test it, he said quietly. The chef nodded and hurried toward the kitchen. The table fell silent again as everyone waited. Madeline rested her chin lightly on her hand, her expression unreadable now. Claire watched her carefully, searching for any hint of concern or relief. But Madeline remained perfectly composed, almost too composed. Ethan noticed the same thing. You seem very confident, he said. Madeline met his gaze steadily. Confidence comes from knowing the truth. Ethan nodded slowly. Then we will see which version of the truth arrives from the kitchen. Several minutes passed. The restaurant's soft music continued playing, and waiters moved quietly around the room as if nothing unusual were happening. Finally, the kitchen door opened again. Chef Tony stepped back into the dining area, holding the spoon carefully with a cloth napkin. His face looked pale. Ethan watched him approach. Well, Ethan asked. Tony hesitated for just a moment before answering. The test detected trace almond protein. The words landed softly but carried enormous weight. Claire felt the air around the table change instantly. Ethan remained still. Madeline remained still as well. But now the conversation was no longer based on patterns or theories. The residue had a name. The words from Chef Tony seemed to linger in the air long after he spoke them. Trace almond protein. The sentence was simple, almost clinical, yet its meaning carried enormous weight at the table. Claire Hart felt the quiet shift immediately. A moment earlier the discussion had still lived in the world of theory and speculation. Now the evidence had moved the conversation into something far more real. Ethan Wells remained perfectly still in his chair, his expression calm, but the calm now felt deliberate rather than casual. He folded his hands slowly on the table, as if placing each thought exactly where it belonged. Across from him, Madeline Cross did not react the way most people might have expected. She did not protest loudly. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and gave a small, thoughtful nod. Interesting, she said quietly. Claire noticed the choice of word immediately. Not shocking. Not impossible. Interesting. It was the kind of response someone used when they were still calculating their next step. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Madeline. The kitchen confirmed there are no almonds in tonight's menu, he said calmly. Madeline's smile returned, though it appeared thinner than before. Yes, I heard. Chef Tony shifted uneasily beside the table, still holding the cloth napkin that had carried the spoon. We double-checked everything, he said quickly. The storage area, the preparation station, even the dessert ingredients. Ethan nodded slightly toward him. Thank you, Tony. The chef stepped back a few feet, clearly relieved to leave the conversation in someone else's hands. For a moment no one spoke. The restaurant's quiet music continued in the background, and the faint clink of glasses from distant tables reminded Claire that the rest of the evening outside this circle was continuing normally. But here, at table 12, the night had become something else entirely. Madeline leaned forward slowly, resting her elbows lightly on the table. So now we know there was almond protein on the spoon, she said. But we still do not know how it got there. Ethan watched her carefully. The sequence suggests contact. Madeline nodded once. Yes, contact. She paused briefly before continuing. But contact does not identify the person responsible. Claire noticed the subtle emphasis in the word responsible. Madeline was shifting the focus again, moving the conversation away from the earlier pattern Ethan had described. Ethan did not interrupt. He simply listened. Madeline gestured lightly toward the dining room. Restaurants are full of movement, she said calmly. Servers, guests, kitchen staff. A spoon could easily be touched by someone else before it reached the table. Claire spoke gently before the idea could settle too comfortably. The spoon came directly from the service tray. Madeline turned her head toward her. You are certain? Claire nodded. Yes. Madeline smiled again, though the expression carried a sharper edge now. You have been watching the entire room very closely. Claire answered calmly. Only the parts that matter. Ethan glanced between them again. Something in Claire's quiet confidence seemed to interest him more with every passing minute. Madeline noticed that as well. "You trust her observations very quickly," she said to Ethan. Ethan did not hesitate. "Because her observations have been accurate so far." Madeline leaned back again in her chair, studying Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "Accuracy can sometimes be coincidence," she replied softly. Ethan's voice remained steady. "Repeated coincidence becomes a pattern." The conversation paused again, but the silence now carried a different feeling. Earlier it had been tense. Now it felt like the final stage of a negotiation, the moment when both sides understood that the truth was approaching whether they welcomed it or not. Noah suddenly looked up from his seat again. "Did the test say the spoon had almonds?" he asked curiously. Ethan turned toward him immediately. "Yes," he said gently. Noah blinked once, thinking about that information with the serious concentration only children could show. "But I did not see any almonds," he said. Claire gave him a small smile. "Sometimes ingredients can be too small to see," she explained. The boy nodded slowly as if that made perfect sense. Then he looked toward Madeline. "Did you touch the spoon again after it fell?" The question was innocent, completely direct, and it caused the entire table to grow still once more. Madeline looked at Noah for several seconds before answering. "I adjusted it," she said carefully. Noah thought again, replaying the moment in his memory. "I remember you using a napkin," he said slowly. Claire felt a subtle spark of realization as the detail emerged. Ethan leaned slightly forward. "A napkin?" he repeated. Noah nodded. "Yeah, you picked it up with the napkin." Madeline's expression remained calm, but Claire noticed the brief tightening in her shoulders. Ethan's voice remained quiet. "That is an interesting detail." Madeline spoke smoothly. "Using a napkin to pick up silverware is not unusual." Ethan nodded slowly. "No, it is not." He paused before adding, "unless the napkin had something on it." The words settled across the table like the final piece of a puzzle beginning to lock into place. Claire realized that the story Madeline had been guiding all evening was starting to unravel, not through accusations or dramatic revelations, but through small details that refused to disappear. And now one more question remained waiting in the silence. What had been on that napkin before it touched the spoon? The quiet question about the napkin seemed to change the rhythm of the entire table. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the distant music in the restaurant suddenly felt softer, as if the room itself were waiting for the next word. Madeline Cross remained composed, but Claire Hart noticed something new in her posture now. Not fear, not panic, calculation. Madeline's eyes moved briefly from Noah to Ethan, then back to the table, as if deciding how much of the truth to reveal and how much to reshape. Ethan leaned slightly forward again, resting one hand calmly against the table surface. "You used a napkin to pick up the spoon," he said quietly. Madeline nodded once. "Yes." "Where is that napkin now?" Ethan asked. Madeline gestured toward the stack of folded linens near the edge of the table. "It would be one of those." Claire followed the gesture. The linens were identical. Perfectly folded squares of white cloth placed neatly beside the plates earlier in the evening. Any one of them could have been used. Ethan looked at the stack for a moment, then turned towards Chef Tony. "Tony," he said calmly, "did the allergen test kit detect almond protein on the napkin that carried the spoon?" Tony hesitated slightly. "We only tested the spoon, sir." Ethan nodded once. "Then we should test the napkin as well." Madeline exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair again. "Ethan, this is becoming excessive." Ethan did not raise his voice. "If the napkin transferred the residue, the test will confirm it." Madeline looked at him steadily. "And if it does not?" Ethan's answer was simple. "Then we will continue asking questions." Claire noticed that Madeline studied Ethan carefully now, as if realizing the situation had already moved beyond her ability to redirect it. "Very well," Madeline said quietly. She lifted one of the folded napkins from the table and placed it beside the spoon. "Test whichever one you like." Chef Tony approached cautiously, using the same cloth to handle the napkin before carrying it toward the kitchen again. The door closed behind him, leaving the table in silence once more. Noah had returned to his dessert menu, whispering to the driver again about chocolate lava cake and vanilla ice cream, blissfully unaware that his small memory about the napkin had changed the entire direction of the evening. Claire watched the boy for a moment, relieved that his world still felt normal. Then she looked back toward Ethan and Madeline. Madeline broke the silence first. Do you know what I find most surprising about tonight? She asked calmly. Ethan waited. That you would place so much trust in a stranger's interpretation of events, Madeline said. Her gaze shifted toward Claire briefly. Someone you met less than 15 minutes ago. Ethan answered without hesitation. Trust is not the issue. Madeline tilted her head slightly. Then what is? Ethan's voice remained steady. Consistency. Madeline studied him for a moment. And you believe my behavior has been inconsistent? Ethan looked at the spoon still resting. On the napkin. You said you only adjusted the spoon after it fell. Madeline nodded. Yes. But Noah remembers the napkin touching the spoon. Ethan continued. Which suggests you handled it more deliberately than simply placing it back on the table. Madeline's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained composed. Or it suggests that a child's memory is not perfect. Claire spoke quietly before the statement could linger too long. Children often remember small movements very clearly. Madeline looked toward her again. You seem very confident about many things. Claire met her gaze calmly. Only about what I see. For a moment neither woman spoke again. Then the kitchen door opened once more. Chef Tony returned slowly, holding the testing strip in his hand. Ethan looked up. What did the test show? Tony cleared his throat. The napkin also tested positive for trace almond protein. The words landed softly but carried unmistakable meaning. Claire felt the shift immediately. The residue had not been limited to the spoon. It had transferred through the cloth as well. Ethan remained still, absorbing the information carefully. Madeline did not react right away. For a brief moment, she simply watched the testing strip in Tony's hand, as if studying a small but inconvenient fact. Then she sighed quietly. So the napkin had almond residue, she said. That still does not explain how it got there. Ethan's gaze lifted slowly to meet hers. No, he said calmly. But it explains how the residue reached the spoon. The statement lingered in the air between them. Madeline folded her hands together again, her expression thoughtful. Ethan, she said softly, you are assuming that I carried almond residue on a napkin to the table. Ethan did not raise his voice. I am observing that the napkin you used contained the allergen. Madeline held his gaze for several seconds before speaking again. And if that napkin came from somewhere else? She asked. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Such as? Madeline smiled faintly, though the warmth was gone now. Such as a place where almond ingredients exist regularly. Claire felt a small spark of realization even before Madeline finished the thought. Madeline gestured lightly toward Claire. For example, she said calmly, a dessert station. Claire stood very still, because suddenly the direction of the conversation had shifted again, and this time the suspicion was moving toward her. For the first time since the conversation began, Claire Hart felt the attention of the entire table shift directly toward her. The room did not grow louder, yet the silence seemed to tighten around the words Madeline had just spoken. A dessert station. The suggestion hung there, quiet but deliberate. Madeline Cross leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed again as if she had finally placed a missing piece into the discussion. After all, she continued smoothly. The kitchen confirmed they do not use almonds in the main courses tonight. But desserts often contain them. Chef Tony blinked quickly. Well, some desserts might, he admitted carefully. But the lava cake does not contain almonds. Madeline gave a small shrug. Even so, a dessert preparation area could easily carry traces of almond protein from previous dishes. Claire understood the strategy immediately. The direction of suspicion had changed. Slowly, subtly. Instead of defending herself, Madeline had introduced a new possibility that placed Claire closer to the source of contamination. Ethan Wells noticed it as well. His gaze moved from Madeline to Claire, not with accusation, but with the same thoughtful curiosity he had shown all evening. Claire remained calm. She had faced uncomfortable assumptions before. Working in restaurants taught people quickly that misunderstandings could appear at any moment. What mattered was responding clearly rather than emotionally. I did not handle the napkin before it reached the table, Claire said quietly. Madeline's smile returned, though it carried a sharper edge. You are certain? Claire nodded. Yes. Madeline tapped her finger lightly on the table again. And yet you were very quick to notice the residue. Claire answered calmly. Because I was watching the table. Madeline's eyes narrowed slightly. Watching very closely. Ethan raised one hand gently before the exchange could become sharper. Let us slow down, he said. The tone of his voice was calm, but unmistakably firm. Both women looked toward him. Claire noticed the detail. Ethan continued. That does not automatically mean she caused it. Madeline tilted her head slightly. Of course not. But if we are discussing sequences, we should examine every possibility. Claire met her gaze without hesitation. Then we should. The quiet confidence in her voice caused a small pause at the table. Madeline studied her carefully, as if reassessing something she had assumed earlier. Tell me something, Claire, Madeline said softly. Were you near the dessert station before coming to this table? Claire shook her head. No, Madeline looked toward Chef Tony. Tony, where is the dessert station located? The chef gestured toward the far side of the dining room, near the pastry display. Over there. Madeline nodded slowly, then looked back at Ethan. You see the problem, she said. If the residue came from a napkin carrying almond protein, and the spoon was lifted with that napkin, we still do not know who handled it before it reached the table. Ethan remained thoughtful, which is why we should confirm the origin. Madeline lifted one eyebrow slightly. And how would you do that? Ethan gestured toward Tony again. Tony, are your service napkins stored in more than one location? Tony shook his head immediately. No, sir. All table linens come from the same storage cabinet in the service hallway. Madeline paused briefly. That answer clearly did not support the theory she had just introduced. Claire noticed the hesitation immediately. Ethan did as well. So the napkins are not stored near the dessert station, Ethan said. Tony nodded. Correct. The quiet confirmation shifted the balance of the conversation again. Madeline's expression remained composed, but Claire saw the faint tightening around her eyes. Ethan leaned slightly forward again, his tone still calm, but more focused now, which means the napkin likely came directly from the table setting. Madeline's voice remained smooth. Or from a nearby service tray. Claire spoke quietly. The service tray did not contain napkins. Madeline turned toward her again. You seem very confident about every step of the process. Claire nodded once. Because I was responsible for the service area near this table. Ethan noticed that detail immediately. You were assigned to this section tonight? Claire answered simply. Yes. Madeline leaned back again, studying Claire more carefully now. The expression on her face had changed from polite dismissal to something more analytical, as if she were trying to decide whether Claire had been a coincidence or an unexpected obstacle. Then you would know exactly which napkins were placed here, Madeline said softly. Claire met her gaze calmly. Yes. Madeline smiled faintly. And yet one of them carried almond protein. The implication lingered quietly between them. Claire did not react emotionally. Instead, she asked a simple question. Where did the napkin come from before it touched the spoon? Madeline did not answer immediately. Ethan spoke instead. That is the key question. The three of them sat in silence for several seconds, each following the same chain of reasoning toward the same point. The napkin had tested positive. The spoon had tested positive. And someone had used the napkin to lift the spoon. Ethan finally looked back at Madeline. Earlier you said you picked up the spoon with that napkin. Madeline nodded slowly. Yes. Ethan's voice remained steady, which means the residue was already on the napkin when you touched it. Madeline held his gaze without speaking. Claire realized what Ethan had just done. Without raising his voice or accusing anyone directly, he had quietly returned the sequence of events to its original position. The napkin had been in Madeline's hand, and the residue had transferred exactly at that moment. For the first time that evening, Madeline Cross did not respond immediately. For several long seconds after Ethan's final observation, the table remained wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before. The quiet restaurant continued around them, glasses clinking softly, waiters moving between tables. But inside the small circle of light above Ethan Wells's table, the conversation had reached a point where every word mattered. Madeline Cross sat perfectly still, her posture elegant, her expression calm, yet the confidence that had guided her earlier explanations no longer carried the same certainty. She studied Ethan carefully, as though measuring how far he had already followed the sequence of events. Claire Hart remained standing beside the table, her hands resting lightly at her sides, watching the exchange with quiet attention. She had not intended to become part of a moment like this, yet somehow the smallest detail she had noticed had unraveled an entire chain of assumptions. Ethan's voice, when he finally spoke again, remained steady and controlled. The napkin was in your hand, he said calmly. Madeline did not immediately disagree. Instead, she leaned back slowly in her chair, folding her hands together as if preparing to choose her next words carefully. Yes, she said. I picked up the spoon with a napkin. Ethan nodded slightly, and the napkin carried almond protein. Madeline gave a soft exhale, almost like a quiet laugh. That is what the test suggests. Ethan's gaze remained steady, which means the residue transferred from the napkin to the spoon at that moment. The statement did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like a conclusion reached after following each step in order. Madeline's eyes moved briefly toward Claire before returning to Ethan. You believe I brought almond residue to the table intentionally, she said quietly. Ethan did not rush his answer. I believe the sequence of events supports that possibility. Madeline remained silent for a few seconds, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Then she spoke again, her tone softer now, almost reflective. Ethan, do you know what the most difficult part of ambition is? The question seemed unexpected, yet Ethan did not dismiss it. What? He asked calmly. Madeline's gaze drifted briefly toward the dining room before returning to him. People assume ambition always looks aggressive, ruthless, obvious. She gave a faint smile. But the most effective ambition is quiet. Claire felt a subtle chill at the shift in Madeline's tone. It was not anger. It was not denial. It sounded more like someone explaining a strategy that had already failed. Ethan watched her without interrupting. Madeline continued. Influence is not gained through loud gestures, she said. It is gained through moments that make people feel dependent on you. Ethan's voice remained level, such as saving someone in a crisis. Madeline nodded once. Exactly. Claire felt the truth of the situation settle quietly over the table. Madeline looked down at the napkin resting near the spoon and shook her head slightly. It was supposed to be very controlled, she said softly. A trace amount. Enough to cause a reaction that could be resolved quickly. Noah continued studying the dessert menu, completely unaware of the confession unfolding around him. Ethan glanced briefly toward his son before returning his attention to Madeline. His expression did not change. You planned a situation where you would appear to rescue him. Madeline met his gaze calmly. Yes. The admission hung in the air without drama, almost matter of fact. Claire felt the weight of it immediately. Madeline continued speaking quietly. The reaction would happen. I would notice first. I would alert everyone. The medication would solve the problem. She paused briefly. And in that moment, I would become the person who protected your son. Ethan remained silent. Madeline's eyes shifted toward Claire again. But I did not expect someone else to notice the detail first. Claire did not respond. She simply held Madeline's gaze calmly. Madeline sighed lightly. You disrupted the sequence. Ethan spoke again, his tone still controlled, but now unmistakably final. You used my son to stage a demonstration of loyalty. Madeline did not argue. I used a small risk to create a powerful impression, she replied quietly. Ethan's expression remained steady. That is not loyalty. Madeline gave a faint nod, as though acknowledging the difference. For a moment the table remained silent again. Then Madeline reached slowly toward her ring finger and slid the engagement ring off her hand. She placed it carefully on the table in front of Ethan. It appears the evening did not go as planned, she said softly. Ethan looked at the ring, but did not touch it. Madeline stood from her chair with the same graceful composure she had shown all evening. I suppose this is where I leave, she said quietly. She glanced once more at Claire before stepping away from the table. The restaurant door closed softly behind her a minute later. The silence she left behind felt very different from the tension that had filled the evening earlier. Noah looked up from the dessert menu again. Did she leave? He asked. Ethan nodded gently. Yes. The boy considered that information for a moment before asking the only question that mattered to him. Can we still get the lava cake? Claire could not help smiling slightly. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then allowed the smallest hint of a smile to appear as well. Yes, he said quietly. I think we should. The restaurant slowly returned to its gentle rhythm after the door closed behind Madeline Cross. Yet something about the evening felt permanently changed. The quiet jazz music continued drifting through the dining room. Waiters resumed their careful movements between tables, and the low conversations of other guests blended back into the background like distant waves. But at table 12, the atmosphere had shifted into something calmer, lighter, almost reflective. Ethan Wells remained seated for a moment. looking at the engagement ring resting on the white tablecloth in front of him. The diamond caught the warm light from the chandelier above, scattering small reflections across the polished surface of the table. He did not touch it. Instead, he simply studied it quietly, as if it were no longer an object of value, but a reminder of how easily a carefully constructed plan could collapse when one unexpected detail appeared. Noah Wells, however, had already moved on from the tension of the evening. Children had a remarkable ability to do that. He looked up from the dessert menu again, with hopeful excitement in his voice. "So, the lava cake?" he asked. Ethan finally let out a quiet breath and looked toward his son, the seriousness in his expression softening almost immediately. "Yes," he said gently. "I think we have earned dessert tonight." Noah grinned widely and leaned forward in his chair. Claire Hart felt a small smile appear on her own face as well. The boy's simple enthusiasm seemed to wash away the heavy atmosphere that had filled the table just minutes earlier. Chef Tony stepped forward quickly, relieved to return to a much more normal task. "One lava cake with vanilla ice cream coming right up," he said with visible enthusiasm before hurrying back toward the kitchen. For the first time that evening, the tension truly began to fade. Claire remained beside the table for a moment longer, unsure whether she should quietly step away now that the situation had resolved. In most restaurants, the correct choice would have been obvious. Serve the table, remain polite, and disappear into the background. But before she could move, Ethan spoke. "Claire." She turned slightly toward him. "Yes." Ethan looked at her carefully, the same thoughtful curiosity still present in his eyes, though now it carried something warmer than before. "You noticed something everyone else missed," he said. Claire shrugged lightly. "It was a small detail." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Small details protect people from big mistakes." Claire did not immediately respond. Instead, she glanced briefly toward Noah, who was now happily watching the kitchen door as if the lava cake might appear at any second. "I was only doing what anyone should do," she said quietly. Ethan studied her for a moment, then gave a small smile. "That is not always as common as it should be." The dessert arrived a few minutes later, the rich chocolate cake sending a warm scent through the air as Tony placed it carefully in front of Noah. The boy's eyes widened with excitement. "This is the best night ever," he announced proudly. Claire laughed softly under her breath. Ethan watched the moment with quiet appreciation. For a few minutes the table became something very ordinary again. A father and his son sharing dessert in a quiet restaurant. The earlier drama seemed almost distant now, like a storm that had passed through quickly and disappeared. Eventually Noah finished the last bite of ice cream and leaned back happily in his chair. "That was amazing," he declared. Ethan glanced at Claire again. "Would you sit for a moment?" he asked. Claire blinked in surprise. "Sit." Ethan gestured lightly toward the empty chair Madeline had used earlier. "You have been standing through the entire evening." Claire hesitated briefly, then sat down carefully at the edge of the chair. It felt strange, crossing the invisible line between server and guest. Ethan noticed her uncertainty. "Relax," he said quietly. "You saved my son tonight." Claire shook her head gently. "I only noticed something unusual." Ethan looked at her with a faint smile. "And you spoke up when it mattered." Noah looked between them curiously. "Claire is really smart," he added confidently. Claire laughed softly again. "Thank you, Noah." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Claire with thoughtful interest. "You said earlier you worked in emergency response," he said. Claire nodded once. "A few years ago." "Why did you stop?" Ethan asked. Claire hesitated briefly before answering. "Sometimes people choose quieter lives after seeing too many emergencies." Ethan nodded slowly as if he understood more than she had actually said. The restaurant lights reflected softly in the window beside them, casting a warm glow across the table. For a moment the conversation settled into a comfortable silence. Then Ethan spoke again. "Would you consider working with me?" Claire looked at him with mild confusion. "Working with you?" Ethan nodded. "My foundation supports medical training programs for communities that need faster emergency response." He paused briefly before adding, "Someone who notices details the way you do would be valuable." Claire considered the idea quietly. It was not the kind of opportunity she had expected when she began her shift that evening. Noah leaned forward excitedly. "That means Claire could hang out with us again," he said. Ethan smiled slightly at his son's enthusiasm, then looked back at Claire. The quiet warmth in his expression was unmistakable now. Claire met his gaze, and for the first time that evening the connection between them felt less like gratitude and more like the beginning of something unexpected. Outside the restaurant window, the city lights glowed softly against the night sky, and inside the quiet table that had witnessed suspicion, strategy, and truth now held something far simpler: respect. And sometimes, respect was the first step toward a very different kind of future. If this story touched you, do not forget to support the channel. Tap like if you enjoy powerful storytelling about courage, truth, and unexpected heroes, and subscribe to Love After Everything channel so you never miss our next touching story. Your support helps us continue bringing cinematic stories where ordinary people change everything with one brave moment. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey.